Okay, talk the Gemara. So we're dealing yesterday with the opinion of Rav Yitzchak ben Pinchas, who holds that shchita of an oaf is not min haTorah. We're on Chaf Ches Amud Aleph. Tashma, malak besakin, if you do malika with a knife, mitame begadim abeis habliya. So then the bird is in a vela, and it contaminates the clothing. There we said, remember that by a kosher bird, so if you have an avela, so if you have a kosher bird that becomes an avela, you're mitame if it goes into your throat, as opposed to a regular animal, that's a kosher animal that becomes an avela. If you touch it, you become tamei, and if you carry it, then your clothing becomes tamei, as opposed to if they would shove it down your throat, you wouldn't become tamei. But by a bird, you don't become tamei from touching a kosher bird and avela, only by swallowing it. So what happened here? You did malika from the back, but you did it with a knife. Says Gemara, if Rav Yitzchak is right that shchita is not biblically required by an oaf, very interesting. What does he say? He says you don't need shchita min haTorah in order to eat a bird. What do you need? You need to take a sword and you just need to pierce one of the pipes, or both of the pipes. So what happens in this case? When we do malika, what do? You do malika from the back. We said you cut the spine and the neck. You don't cut rove of the basar, we said, because if you would cut rove of the basar at that time, then before you even get to the pipes, you already made it into a treifa, and it's gone. But if you cut the neck and the spine, and you don't cut rove of the basar, then when you do the malika, you actually cut the pipes, you're good to go. So what happened in this case? You took a knife, and you did it from the back. So that's not allowed. But now you cut the neck and the spine, and not rove of the basar. So what happened? So we said over here, if you cut the neck and the spine, and then you continue, and you do the shchita down from the back, it's puzzle. It's an avela, and it's going to be treifa if you swallow it. Well, what's the problem? According to the opinion that holds that you don't need shchita, so what happened here? With the knife, what did you do? Obviously, if you cut most of the basar with the knife also, you're done. But here you cut the neck and the spine and not most of the basar with the knife. What happened? It became a treifa. We know that if you do a kosher shchita on a treifa, it's not metame. So now if you're a regular person and you take the knife and you go to the front and you cut it, so now you made that animal, which was a treifa, no longer an avela. You can't eat it, of course, but it's not an avela. But according to Rav Yitzchak ben Pinchas, you don't have to even take the shchita knife from the front. You can continue with the shchita knife from the back. If you continue down and now you sever one of the pipes, so einachanami, you can eat it, but it shouldn't be an avela. Because according to him, you don't need to do regular shchita on an oaf. So why are you telling me that if you have this animal that you go from the back, it becomes an avela? According to him, the first cut, which cut the neck bone and the spine, makes it a treifa. But also we know that if you take a treifa and you shecht it properly, you can eat it, but it doesn't become an avela. So now he continued with the knife, he cut from the back. According to him, that's perfectly fine. He cuts one of the pipes, and now it should be not an avela. Why is it an avela? I just learned also, he told me, the guy who took me around yesterday, again, he told me that in the yeshivas, I didn't realize this, in the yeshivas, they used to fast when they were learning CHULLIN, because they used to go like this. When they were doing like, when you shecht, and they would go like this, and you're not supposed to do that. So if you ever see me do that, just tell me not to do that, because you're not supposed to like pretend to shecht on yourself. So they used to do it while they were learning, they weren't thinking about it, so they'd have to, I don't know if they fasted every day, they'd have to fast when they were learning CHULLIN in the yeshiva, he said, because people would go like this, and you're not supposed to do that. Okay, so says the Gemara, but according to Rav Yitzchak ben Pinchas, if you shecht the animal from the back, it should be perfectly fine. You can't eat it, but it shouldn't be an avela. Says the Gemara, Hoda Amar Ki Aitana. You're right. This brisa of malak besakim mitame begadim abeis habliya is definitely a contradiction on Rav Yitzchak. But that's fine, because when you bring contradiction on somebody, it's only a problem if he has nobody to support him. But he has another person that supports him, that shchita by an oaf is not min haTorah. Where do we see that he has a support? For that, Titania. Rabbi Lazar akafar beRebbi, Rabbi Lazar akafar, not in the name of Rebbe, the great, Rashi says, Matam elomar ach kasher yachelas hatzvi. We said over here that you can eat, just like you eat deer, you can eat it. What's it? You can eat psulei hamukdashin. Again, we know that certain animals that were set aside to be brought as korbanos, if they get a mum, then you can't bring them as a korban, but that same mum doesn't necessarily make it a mum that you can't eat it. So let's say you have an animal that's supposed to be a korban, it gets a mum, it can no longer be a korban, but you can still, it's not a mum in the sense that you can't eat it, it's not a treifa, so now you take that, you redeem it, and you can eat it. So it says the Gemara, just like you could eat a tzvi, you could eat psulei hamukdashin that was redeemed. Says the Gemara, not only are we learning from a deer to psulei hamukdashin, just like you could eat a deer, which is a non-domesticated animal, just like you could eat that, you could eat psulei hamukdashin that's redeemed. We're going to learn from psulei hamukdashin to a deer as well. What's that? Mak is tzvi v'ayil psulei hamukdashin. Ma psulei hamukdashin b'shchita, af tzvi v'ayil b'shchita, v'of ein lo shchita midivrei Torah, elemi divrei sofrim. So this, Man de Omer clearly holds that Just like what? Just like you can eat a tzvi and an ayil, you can also eat psulam megdashim that's redeemed. And he learns the other way. Just like you could eat psulam megdashim, just like psulam megdashim that you're eating needs shchita, so too a tzvi and an ayil needs shchita. But he clearly says what? Mefurash, he says, an oaf ein lo shchita midivrei Torah ela midivrei sofrim. This is the basis of Rav Yitzchak ben Pinchas' opinion, which is all that we want to bring this brisa to show that he has a precedent where there's somebody else who holds that shchita by a bird is not midoraisa, it's only midirabanan. Fine. Mantana de Palagalad Rabbi Akafar. So now the question becomes, who is this man de Amar? If you're saying that this malach besakin, that if you use a knife and you cut with a sakin, according to Rav Yitzchak ben Pinchas, it should not be an avela. So who's that opinion that holds that shchita of an oaf is min haTorah, basically? Because again, if it's min haTorah, then if you continue to cut it through the back, it becomes an avela, which is what this brisa says. Rabbi hi detanya, Rabbi Omer v'zavachta kasher tzivisicha. You have to slaughter your animals, your cattle, as I have commanded you. Milamit shenistave Moshe ala veshet v'ala kaneh. You see that Moshe was taught halach l'Moshe misinai about the veshet, the esophagus, and the kaneh, the trachea. V'al rov echad ba'of, v'al rov shnayim b'behema. Rav clearly says what? Rebbe clearly says that what? That not only was Moshe Rabbeinu taught about the kaneh and the veshet at halach l'Moshe misinai, he was also taught that an oaf needs to have one pipe severed and a behema needs two pipes severed. What does he clearly hold? He's clearly holding that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was talking to Moshe Rabbeinu about slaughtering oafs when he was on Har Sinai. Therefore, you clearly see that not only is slaughtering an oaf midirabanan, as Rav Yitzchak ben Pinchas holds, but according to Rebbe, the Halach l'Moshe misinai, he wouldn't have spoken to him about slaughtering a rov versus 1 versus 2 if it wasn't midoraisa. So you clearly see that according to Rebbe, shchita is min haTorah. Again, min haTorah meaning halacha l'Moshe misinai. So you have that machlokes again: is shchita min haTorah, halacha l'Moshe misinai, or is it only midirabanan by an oaf? Everybody agrees that by a behema, it's halacha l'Moshe misinai. Says the Gemara. Echad ba'of. So we said that regardless of what you hold, echad ba'of, one is enough. It means by an oaf, let's assume you say it's midaraisa, so you have to shech an oaf, but even if you say midarabani, you have to shech an oaf. Echad ba'of, one of the two simanim by an oaf is enough. So we always assume that either one is fine. That's how we've assumed until now. The veshet or the kaneh, the esophagus or the trachea. We're going to see now that there's going to be opinion, Rav Ada bar Ava, that a dafka has to be the esophagus, if you're going to do one. If you do both, obviously you do both. But if you only want to do one, it needs to be the esophagus, which is the more chashuv of the two. Says the Gemara, Idmar Rav Nachman Amar, O veshet O kaneh. Either the esophagus, it's really O veshet. Either the veshet or the kaneh. Obviously, you could also cut the kaneh, but if you're only going to cut one, the trachea, the kaneh by itself will not be enough. Rav Nachman Amar, O veishet o kaneh, echad kitani. It's clear that the pasuk that the Gemara says, echad ha'of, the Mishnah says, echad kol dehu, whichever one you want to cut, you just got to cut one of them. Rav Ada bar Avra Amar, veishet velo kaneh. If you're going to cut only one, it's got to be the esophagus. My echad, so what does it mean you only have to cut one? You have to cut the miyuchad one, the special one. And as we'll see, the esophagus, the veishet is considered to be the special one because it's the more important of the two pipes. And that's why the halacha is, as we'll see, that if there's even a little hole in the esophagus, it's going to be a problem, as opposed to the trachea, where up to 50%, as we've seen until now, even if it's 50% of it is already severed, if you go ahead, if you remember, and you do even a little bit, that's considered to be rov, but up to 50%, including 50% of the trachea, is not a problem if it's cut by itself. Or if you cut 50%, you haven't done anything to the animal. But it's after 50%, but an esophagus, even if a small piece of it is missing, it's going to be a problem. So since you see that the esophagus is more chashuv, he holds that when it says you have to cut one, or if you only want to cut one, you can cut one, it's dafka, the esophagus, that's going to be enough, not the trachea.
Is it a biological thing? In other words, the animal is more...
So that's what it sounds like. It sounds like it's the more important of the two, that if you have 50, that then an animal can live with 50% of its trachea for at least a little time, we said.
Not a little bit of the esophagus makes the animal...
That's what it sounds like. Correct. It sounds right. An esophagus, a little hole in the esophagus.
You're the expert now, so
I'm not the expert, but the little hole in the esophagus makes it a treifa. Halachically, we're saying a little bit. Right. I didn't see chickens. I only saw cows. A little bit of a hole in the esophagus makes it a treifa, which we assume it's going to die soon. A hole in the trachea, we said it could live for a long time until 50% of its trachea is cut. Says the Gemara. So that's the machlokas. So now we're going to bring different proofs for and against each of these man amars. It says again either or. That's the first opinion, Rav Nachman. Rav Ada says, of course you could cut both, but if you're going to cut only one, it needs to be the esophagus and not the trachea. Siman shachat. We hold, and we've been assuming the whole time, that either or. Siman shachat chatzan gageres pigima dechatas ha'of. Meisvei, they asked a question on Rav Nachman who says either or. So the first two will be on the question of either or. The next three will question the opinion that holds both, or that it has to be the esophagus. Meisvei, shachar et aveshed ve'achach nishmata gargeres. If you cut the trachea, if you cut the esophagus, and then you see afterwards that the trachea becomes detached from the jaw, kshera. Why? Because the esophagus is the only one that really needs to be cut. Therefore, once you cut the esophagus, if the trachea then becomes detached, we don't care anymore, it's already kosher. If the trachea becomes detached and then you cut the esophagus, psula, it's going to be possible again, because at the time that you cut the esophagus, which is the essential one, which is what we're bringing the proof for, when you cut the esophagus, it was already a treifa because the trachea was dislodged and detached. Let's say you cut the esophagus and then you see afterwards the trachea is detached. But now you don't know when the trachea detached. If it detached after you cut the esophagus, no problem. But had it detached before you cut the esophagus, it would be a problem. Any safek b'shchita, you have to assume the worst. Therefore, if you see that it's detached, now you have to assume that it's detached before you cut the esophagus, and it's going to be a problem. But what do you see from here either way? It doesn't talk about just shachting the trachea. The only examples it's giving is shachting the esophagus, and the only question is, was the trachea detached before or after? But it never gives a havamina that you could just shach the trachea. It's clearly a proof of the opinion that says if you're going to shacht one, you have to shacht the esophagus. Says Gemara, no, mishum de gargeres avida lishtamute. No, nobody says you can't just shacht the trachea. The reason it's talking about shachting the esophagus here is because we're talking about a case where the trachea becomes detached. The trachea becomes detached, the esophagus doesn't become detached. So we're just talking about metzias. We happen to be talking about cases, we want to know the halacha when the trachea becomes detached. But in Achanami, we're going to discuss elsewhere that a trachea, which actually is cut by itself, will be kosher. So you can't bring any proofs. The fact that it's discussing cutting his esophagus here, it's just discussing this specific case. But in a Chanami, we would hold, the Mandamar would hold, that Rav Nachman would hold, that in a Chanami, elsewhere it'll talk about cutting a trachea by itself. So you have no proof against Rav Nachman. Toshma, another proof that a dafka needs to be the esophagus, which we'll reject as well. Shachat shnei chatzoi siman ebof. If you slaughter two halves exactly, psula. All right, and even if you slaughter one half, right? If you slaughter two halves, because a half is not enough, it has to be at least rove of one. Vein sarich lomar bebehema, for sure by a behema, which you need two simanim. If you shech the half of both, it's not a rove. Says Gemara, ache yishchod et haveshed v'ed havridin. So derech agav, we're bringing in now. The Rabbi Yehuda adds that when you do shchita, not only do you have to shech the veshed, you have to shech the vridin as well. What are the vridin? The vridin, we said, is a machlokes. Either it's the what's it called? The cordiode or something. The right? But we're saying, according to Rashi, it's the main blood vessels in the neck. That's how we're going to learn. So not only do you have to shech the vesh, you have to shech the main blood vessels in the neck. We're going to get to the vridin in just a second. We'll talk about that the rest of the day. But before we get there, what do you clearly see from Rabbi Yehuda? What are you shechting? The vridin with the veshet, with the esophagus. It doesn't say that you have to shecht just the trachea and the vridin. You clearly see that if you're going to shecht only one, you got to shecht the esophagus. Says the Gemara, no, mishum de veshet samuch levridin. No, in Achanami you could shecht the trachea by itself. But since we're discussing vridin, which of the two is closer to the vridin, to the blood vessels in the neck? The closer one is the esophagus. But in Achanami, Rav Nachman would argue that if you just shechted the trachea with the vridin, you'd be okay. That's what the Gemara says. So those were proofs that we tried to bring against Rav Nachman, who says either or, and Lamaisa, we were not successful. So now we're going to bring proofs against Rav Adu, who says the dafka has to be the esophagus. We're going to bring a few proofs that shows that if you shech the trachea, you're good to go. Tashma shachat chatzi gargeres v'shah kedei shchita acheres. If you shech only half the trachea, and then you do shehiyah, which again we know is asur during shchita, v'gamar, then you finish it, shchita so kshera. So if you do half of the trachea and then you finish it, the shchita is kosher. Now what's the opinion? My la ba'of, it seems like we're dealing with the oaf. Umay gemar, what does it mean you finish it? Gemar legargeres. So again, why is it not a problem when you cut half the trachea? Because we said half the trachea is nothing. So you cut half the trachea, there's no problem of shehiyah because it's nothing. Now what happens? It says you're finishing the trachea and it's kosher. So we understand why there was no shehiyah because half the trachea is nothing. Now you touch the trachea, you finish it, it's as if you did rove and it's kosher. What does that mean? Even though you only cut the trachea. Says the Gemara, no, lo, that's not discussing a behema, that's not discussing an oaf. You'd have a good proof if that was an oaf. It's talking about a behema. Behema, umay gemara, gemara l'shchita kula. Now what's the case? It's a case where you cut half of the trachea of a behema. You didn't ruin it yet because half a trachea is fine. Then you finish a trachea and you cut the esophagus. Now you cut both simanim by a behema, that's why it's kosher. But in a chanami, if it was an oaf and you just finished a trachea, Rav Adu would say that the halacha would be that it wouldn't be able to be eaten because you'd have to cut the esophagus as well. So you have no proof again. Another attempt to say that either or is fine. Tashma haresha yachatzi kane pagum. Again, it doesn't mean pagum here. It means that half of the trachea was cut. V'hotzav alav kolshu gemara. And again, you touch it and you finish it. Shchitas ukshera. Same proof. You touch it and you finish it. The shchitas kasher. What are we talking about? If it's a bird, it's a perfect proof for Rav Nachman. Says Gemara, my love ba'ofa my Gemara lakan. Is it not talking about a case of a bird and you just touch it and you finish it and lemaisa you cut the trachea? That's enough. Lo, same answer. Bebehema umay Gemara leveshet. It's talking about a behema. And it was already 50% of the trachea was cut. You finish a trachea and you cut the esophagus. Now you cut both of the simanim, and that's why it's kosher. But Elachanami, Rav Ada would say that if it was a bird and you just finish the trachea, it would not be kosher because you need to do the esophagus as well. Final proof against Rav Nachman. Final proof against Rav Ada. Tashma. Keitzad molkin chatas of. How do you do malika on a bird chatas, which needs what? Which needs only one. Chotech shidro mafrekes below rabba. So as we said, again, everything's coming back now because we keep having the same thing, Baruch Hashem. So you go to the back and you cut the spine and the neck and not rov basar, because if you cut rov basar, you ruin it. Then you cut what? Then you cut one of the simanim. Ad shemagia laveshet olakana. It's very clear. When you do the malika, you don't ruin it, you don't make it a treifa, you don't cut rov of the basar, you just do the neck and the spine. Then you get to the kana o the veshet. Higia leveshet o lakana, chotech siman echad v'rov basar imo, uva o l'shnayim o rov shnayim, because we said by noli you have to do both. But what do you clearly see? You clearly see that by malika, if you do one, it's enough. Tiyufta de ravada barava, tiyufta. We assume that malika and shchita are the same thing, as we'll see in a second. Therefore, you clearly see that by malika of a bird and therefore shchita of a bird, if you go ahead and you do only one, even if that one is only the trachea, you are good to go. Says the Gemara, my hava. So what would be the halacha by actual shchita? That was by malika. What would be the halacha by shchita if you actually do one? My hava. What do you mean? Kiddush. What do you mean? Exactly what we said. Just like malika is enough if just the trachea is cut, so to shchita will be enough if just the trachea is cut. Dioma shari hasam dika shidru mafrekes. The Gemara says, no, 1 second. Maybe Ravad is not so off. Maybe by malika, we're more lenient that only the trachea needs to be cut. Why? Because once you're already cutting most of the animal, you're cutting the neck, you're cutting the spine. Now we're going to say, well, once you already ruined half the animal, so now if you just cut the trachea with the malika, finish the malika with the trachea, that's fine. But maybe shchita, where you're not cutting the neck and the spine, you're coming from the front. Maybe when you cut it from the front, you need to do specifically what? This is the esophagus. Says the Gemara, Tashma. No, I'll show you clearly that even when you do shchita, the trachea is enough. Dahahu bar avza, dahava be Rava, there was a duck, a live duck that was in Rava's house. Asaki mimasmas koe dema. Very fascinating. He had neck, he was alive, but he had blood all over his neck. So they weren't sure if he got into a fight with somebody and he killed the other guy and it was all over him and it was just fine, or if he was actually had internal bleeding, which would be a makkah, which would be a problem. So Amar Rava hechi navit. So how are we going to do the examination? We need to check him to make sure what? We need to check to make sure that the esophagus doesn't have a little hole in it, or to make sure that the trachea is not more than 50% cut. So how do we do this? It's still alive. So says Gemara, why don't we just shecht it? Well, if you shecht it, what happens when you shecht it? You might shecht it at the spot where it already has the bruise, and then when you finish, you're not going to know that it had the bruise. So you can't shecht it. You also can't check it. How do you check an esophagus and a trachea from the outside of the animal? So listen to the genius. Says the Gemara, nishchetei v'hadar nivdekei. Let's shecht it and then check it. Dioma b'makom nekef kashachid. You can't do that because maybe it had the hole or the problem at the place you end up shechting it. You're not going to notice it after you shecht it, but it was already a problem before it. Nivdekei v'hadar nishchetei. If you check it first, Amar Rabba, yes, the trachea you could check from the outside. If you feel the neck, you could feel if the trachea is 50% cut. I felt it yesterday. They were able to feel the trachea from the outside. Again, the esophagus, which is much softer, you can't feel from the outside. And you can't put your hands into the live animal and check the esophagus while it's still alive. So what do you do? What do you do? So his son, he gave him nachas. Amalei Rav Yosef Brei, he says, do the following. Nivdegve lechane. Check the kane from the outside. You could check a trachea from the outside. So feel the bottom of the duck and see if his trachea is not 50%. So it's not 50% cut, good to go. Then you could shech the trachea. Because you could, from the outside, if you could check the trachea from the outside, you could then shecht it. You know that it was good. Then v'lachsherei, then you know that what, it's kosher. But now you just have to make sure that what? That the esophagus didn't have a problem with it. So it's similar to like the cow we were talking about where you check the lungs afterwards. Now you can check the esophagus afterwards. V'hadar lifchua leveshet v'livdekei. Before you eat it, check the veshet. Amarava chachim yosei bri b'treifas k'Rebbi Yochanan. Oh, you're such a chacham. But what do you see from there? That if you shech just the trachea and then you check the esophagus afterwards, it's perfectly fine. because you don't have to shech the esophagus. That's clearly a proof that even by shchita, just the trachea is enough. Alma echad dika'amar ohai ohai. Therefore, we have a conclusive proof that we paskin that by a bird, either one is fine, and we don't paskin like Rav Ada, we paskin like Rav Nachman, either this or that. And therefore, again, in a case where you're not sure, since there's no way to check the esophagus from the outside, you check the trachea from the outside, you make sure it's fine. If it's fine, you cut the trachea, then you do a badika, again, of the esophagus, equivalent that you would do on a cow when you check the lungs after the shchita. Rav Yehuda Omer Ad Sheyishchat. So let's just talk a little bit about the vridin, the main blood vessels of the neck. He says that when you do the shchita, not only do you have to shech the animal, you have to shech the kana, the esophagus, and the trachea, you have to shech the vridin as well. You have to cut the main blood vessels of the neck. Why would you have to do that? Says Gemara Amar Rav Chisda, Lo Amar Rav Yehuda Ela Ba'of. Rabbi Yehuda holds, he's clarifying Rabbi Yehuda, Rav Chisda is clarifying Rabbi Yehuda, says it's only by an oath that when you do the shchita, you have to shech the blood vessels as well. Hoel v'tsoleo kulo ke'echad, aval behema kevan dimenatcha ever lo tzarech. So according to Rav Chisda, what's the reason that Rabbi Yehuda holds you have to sever the blood vessels when you do shchita? Is because there's a lot of blood in the neck blood vessels. So what do you need to do? Well, when you have an oath, he holds that Rabbi Yehuda is specifically talking about an oath. Why? Because an oath, what do you do after you do the shchita? You literally can roast it while it's whole. So if you don't drain the blood vessels right away during the shchita, you can have all of the blood, which is going to be an isser dam, in the actual animal, even if you go ahead, let's say, and salt it and then roast it. But by a behema, a cow, what are you doing? You're going to end up chopping it up anyway. Throughout the process of chopping it up, all the blood is going to come out of the neck blood vessels anyway, and it's going to be gone. So he says that when Rabbi Yehuda says you have to do the veshet during the shchita, it's specifically by an oath. Because by a behema, it's going to come out anyway. And as we're going to see, when he says you have to do it during the shchita, the reason you have to do it during the shchita, like right next to the shchita, is because if you wait a little bit, the blood's going to congeal. So if you do it during the shchita, the blood is still warm and flowing. So you do the shchita. Right after the shchita or during the process of the shchita, we'll see whether it's ma'akev, the shchita or not. Is this like a new part of the shchita now that you need to do not only the two simanim and the vridin, or is this just, as we'll see in a second, which we're going to pass on, like you do the shchita, it's not inherent part of the shchita, you do the shchita, and then you empty the vridin right away. But the point is that the reason you're emptying it right away is because when it's warm and flowing, it's going to come out right away. So it comes out that this is by according, again, Rabbi Yehuda just says you have to do shchita on the vridin as well. We're going to see that means a shchita and then quickly empty the vridin. Rav Chisda is clarifying that when Rav Yehuda says you have to do vridin right away, it's specifically an oaf, which you're going to go ahead and roast whole. Einachanami, if you would take a cow, like I saw yesterday, there's whole cows, and you would literally roast those cows whole right away, Einachanami, you'd have to go ahead and empty the vridin right away as well. But it's because usually we cut up a cow into pieces, he's not as concerned, says Rav Chisda, with emptying the vridin right away. It's specifically an oaf, which you're going to go ahead and you're going to roast right away. Specifically that, you need to make sure to get the blood out of the neck blood vessels as soon as possible. Says the Gemara, L'meimer d'taimer Rabbi Yehuda mishum damu. So this is clear. It seems like the reason of Rabbi Yehuda, the way we're explaining Rav Chisda, because if it wasn't because of the blood coming out, then why would there be a nafkamina between an oaf and a behema? If it's just a halachic thing that hatlacha Moshe Misina that you got to empty out the vridin, who cares that it's an oaf versus a behema? The fact that he clarifies Rabbi Yehuda as specifically talking about an oaf shows clearly that it's a din in getting the blood out. So if it's a din in getting the blood out, v'atna, we have a mishnah that says Rabbi Yehuda Omer ad sheyishchod et avridin. If it's a din in getting the blood out, why does it sound like when Rabbi Yehuda talks it needs to be yishchod avridin? You have to shech the vridin. Since when did the vridin? If it's a din in shchita alach l'moshe misin, I understand. But if you tell me there's a din in getting the blood out, why does it have to be part of the shchita? Why do I have to cut the two simanim now and the vridin at the same time? Let me cut the two simanim, and like I saw yesterday at the shacht house, what do? They cut the simanim, and then afterwards, even the non-kosher animals, I told you, they take off the head. So they cut the two simanim, and then afterwards, just empty the vridin. Take like a sword and just poke the vridin and let it come out. What does it be part of the shchita process? And Gemara says, Einachanami, he didn't mean literally you have to shecht it. Ema, acheyinko v'esavridin. You're right. It's just to get the blood out, and therefore it's not part of the shchita. Umay acheyishko. What did he mean when he says acheyishko? Acheyinko b'shah shchita. He doesn't mean you have to shecht. It's not part of the shechting process. It needs to be done right after the shechita for the reasons I was just explaining to you, that it's warm and free-flowing and therefore einachanami. But it's not an inherent part of the shechita process. Therefore, by the oaf, you do it right away. By the behema, you have a little bit more time. Again, by the behema, you would probably say l'chatchila, you should do it right away. But since you're going to end up cutting it up into pieces anyway, you're going to end up getting the blood out eventually. Tashma, Vridin b'shchita divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Same exact question. It sounds like the Vridin are part of the shchita process. Ema no, Vridin sarech lenakvan b'shash shchita. They're not part of the shchita process. You just have to empty them out and drain them during the shchita process. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. One more challenge. Tashma, Amru lo Rabbi Yehuda me'achar shelo hiskuru Vridin elo lahotzi me'an dam. If according to you the Vridin are only going to be punctured to get out the dam, mali b'shchita, mali shelo b'shchita. What does that imply? It implies that Rabbi Yehuda got up in the base medrash and says you need to take the Vridin and b'shash shchita. They said to him, I don't understand. If the whole purpose of emptying the vridin is just to get out the dam, why does it have to be done b'shas shchita? Meklal Rabbi Yehuda savar b'shchita. It sounds like Rabbi Yehuda got up in the base medrash and says, you got to do it as part of the shchita. What's pshat? Says Gemara hachi kamar lo. No. They said to him, not why do you have to do it as part of the shchita. They said, why are you so makbid on doing it right away? We understand. You're not saying it's part of the shchita process. But why are you so makbid to empty it out right away when you do the shchita? For the reason I just told you. That at the time of shchita, the blood is still warm. It's still alive and warm. Therefore, again, lechatchila, what do? You empty out the vridin, you empty out the neck vessels as soon as you do the shchita. So the shchita is a shchita of the two simanim. But then again, you should empty out the neck vessels right away. It doesn't have to be with a shchita knife. It can be with any other knife. And lemaisa, you empty out the vessels when it's warm. That's by an oath. You could do that by a behema too, and you should do it by a behema. But if you don't do it by a behema, it's not the end of the world. It'll come out when you cut it up into pieces.
Why is there no kisui down in the behema?
The pasuk says, "Dafka by a non-domesticated animal and an oath." Yeah, yeah. Boy, Rabbi Yirmiyah. Vridin Rabbi Yehuda shaha bahen daras ben. So now Rabbi Yirmiyah was not aware of Rabbi Yehuda's answer, because according to what we just said, the vridin are not part of the shchita process. So clearly, if you do shehiyah by the vridin, by the emptying of the vridin, it's not a problem. You don't even have to use a knife. You could just poke it. Rabbi Yirmiyah wasn't clear. He had not yet heard that Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold that it's part of the shchita process. So he asks, "Boy, Rabbi Yirmiyah, vridin Rabbi Yehuda shaben daras behen mahu." Is it a problem to do shehiyah? We know the answer to that question is, of course not. It's not part of the shchita process. But in essence, he was asking, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is emptying the vridin part of the shchita process or not? He didn't know. We already know the answer is no, but he didn't know. Amar le'ahu saba hachi amar Rabbi Elazar, ve'amri lo or amri le'ahu saba Rabbi Elazar hachi amar Rabbi Yochanan min nakvan bekotz ve'heng sherim. It's not part of the shchita process. You can even use a thorn to empty them out. Again, you should do it right away, but you could even use a thorn. So we came out again that shchita is on the two simanim, or on an oath, it's on the one siman, and then you should empty out the vridin as well, but it doesn't have to be as part of the shchita process. You can if you want, but it doesn't have to be part of the shchita process. Tanya Kavasid Rav Chisda. Let's just finish up with this. So we taught a brisa that agrees with Rav Chisda that what? That again, the vridin have to be emptied on an oath, but not on a behema right away. Shachat shnei chatzai simanim ba'of. If you shach two halves of the pipes of a bird, pasul, because again, what? You have to not even have a rov of one. Vein zarach lomar bebehema. Rabbi Yehuda omer be'of ad sheyishchod et haveshev et havridin. You clearly see, we already had this price. So then what does Rabbi Yehuda come? He says you have to shech the vridin when, which we're not saying shech, you have to empty the vridin when, dafka by an oath. Specifically by an oath, it's going to be a problem, and not by a behema. You don't have to just empty the vridin by a behema because it's going to be emptied later anyway. Fine. So again, we see that approved for Rav Chisda. Let's just do a little more. Chatzi echad ba'of. We said that half of a pipe of a bird or 1.5 pipes of an animal is going to be a problem because it needs to be more than half. Listen to this. We've assumed the whole time that rov means what? 50.1%. That's rov. Rav holds that rov is 50%. Fascinating. Where is that? Inmar. Rav amar mechsa al mechsa kirov. If you even cut, let's just assume an oath for argument's sake, but it could be a behema both. But let's just assume you cut one of the pipes of an oath. So we assumed if you cut 51% of either one, you're fine. Says Rav, even if you cut 50% of one, you're fine. What's pshat? Rav Kahana mar mechsa mechsa ena karov. No, it's got to be 51%. What's Rav's pshat? He has a misora. Rav amar mechsa mechsa karov. Again, we're not going to pass like Rav. We haven't seen like Rav the entire time. But Rav is an interesting svara. Hachi amalei rachman el-Moshe. You know what HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai? Lo tishayer ruba. When you do shchita, you can't leave over a rov. Which means what? If you do 50%, you didn't leave over a rov. You only left over 50%. That's fine. The way we learned is Rav Kahana mar mechsa mechsa ena rov. Why? Kirov hachi amar le'rachmana shechod ruba. So did Hashem, the question is a Masorah, did Hashem tell Moshe Rabbeinu not to leave over a rov, which is not the way that we understood, therefore 50% is fine, or you have to shech the rov, which is how we understood 51%. Says Gemara, we're going to ask a bunch of questions on Rav, who holds that 50% is a rov. Tnan, again, nobody ever seems to learn like this. If you cut half by an oath, we clearly see, or 1.5 by an animal, it's pasul. What's pshat? Says the Gemara, if you hold that half and half is a rov, like you said on my pasul, What's wrong with cutting half? Ha'avid le'rov. Says the Gemara, no. Rav will tell you, midirabanan dilma lo asilam avid palga. Midaraisa, when God spoke to Moshe, half is fine. And on a daraisa level, you cut exactly half, that's a rov. This Mishnah is talking about a dirabanan, that we don't let you cut exactly half because we're afraid that you're going to do 49.1% or 49.9%. But in Achanami, midaraisa, Rav would say half is fine. Amrav Katina Tashma, another question on Rav. Chelku l'shnaim. Of course, we have to have a little bit of tum and tara. So it says that if you have an oven, so if you have an earthenware oven, how do you mitaher an earthenware oven that becomes tameh? You have to smash it. Now it's interesting, but if you want to smash it, so usually it's best if you want to put it back together, not to smash it into small pieces. So what do? You can actually, the halacha is that if you cut it into two big pieces, so if one of the pieces is not a majority of the original oven, means you're able to cut it into, let's say, that's why if you cut it into three pieces, 33, 33, and 33%, you're fine. But if you cut it into two pieces, the Gemara says, it's going to be a problem. V'hein shavin, shneim tamein. If they're exactly equal, it's going to be tamei. Why lefi she'iev shar letzamtim? You have to assume that one of the pieces is 51% and one of the pieces is 49%. And if any of the pieces after you break an oven is still more than 50%, then it's as if the whole oven is still intact and l'maisa it's still tamei. But if you would break it up into 33, 33, 33, then you could put it back together. Says Gemara ha'ef shar letzamtim. What does that imply? That implies that if you were able to know for sure that you have 50% of the oven on this side and 50% of the oven on this side, what? You can't do that in Mitzias. But let's say you were able to Tahorin. It would be Tahor. But according to Rav, what happens if you have 50% of the oven on one side and 50% of the oven on the other side? You still have rov of the oven. Rov of the oven, why should it be Tahor? According to you, 50% is like rov. If you have rov of the oven left, then Lamais it should be Tameh still. Amai Tahorin, Zil Hacha Ikaruba, Zil Hacha Ikaruba. Says Gemara, Amar Papa, no. Trei Rubo B'chad Mana Leka. No. When he was talking about rov, he said 50% is rov in the case of like slaughtering. You slaughter the thing. We don't care about the unslaughtered part. All we got to look at is the slaughtered part. That's 50%. That 50% that you slaughtered is rov. Here, you have a logistic problem. If you're going to tell me, even Rav's going to agree, if you cut an oven exactly in half and you have half here and half here, he's going to obviously agree that both halves cannot be a rov. You can't say this is 50.1%, this is 51%, that's more than 100%. So in that specific case, he'll agree that when you cut an oven exactly into half, it's not going to work. But in our case, where you're severing something, we don't care about the other half, then you can say 50% is considered to be a rov. So we don't have a kasha from the question of the oven. That's a totally separate case. Finally, tashma shachat chatzi gager v'shaba. Let's say you shacht half of the trachea. We said again half the trachea. Until now, we've been saying half the trachea is not a problem. If you shachat half the trachea and then you wake, they shchita acheres u'gemara shchita so kshera. We said half the trachea is not a problem, but according to Rav, what? Once you shaft half the trachea, or once half the trachea is already severed, it's as if rov of the trachea is severed and it should be pasul. And then if you do shehiyah, it should be pasul. If you say that half and half is a rov, itrafala. Then lamaisa, if you shaft half, it should be a treifa. I understand. When it's fully severed again, so if it was fully severed before the shechita, it's a treifa. If you're saying that half of it is as if you did most of it, then if you do half of it, then it's going to be a problem. Says Gemara, what are you talking about? It's not a problem. Misfaris behema. We're not dealing with the behema, which is both simanim. We're dealing with, because again, if it's both simanim, and you hold that half is rov, then you basically shechted half, which is rov. You did shehiyah, you waited, you didn't then shech the other siman, you're done. For sure that's a proof against Rav. But if we're dealing with an oaf, then there's no problem in manavshach. Why? Because lo be'oaf, we're dealing with an oaf, manavshach. If you say like me, that mechsa is a rov, ha'avid le'ruba. Then when you shafted the original 50%, you did rov and you finished. And if you want to say like yourself, that 50 to 50 what? That 50% is not rov, lo avid lo klum, then you haven't done anything wrong. So either way, this brisa will work, bain me or bain you. It's not a proof against me. It's only a proof against me if we're dealing with a behema. If we're dealing with a behema and it says that once you do half, what? Yeah. And then you do shehiyah, you could still do kshera. That's a problem, because then according to me, I shafted rov of the trachea, I waited, then I finished it and it's still kshera. That doesn't make sense. So he says, you're right, the halacha here would be that if you do half of the trachea and you wait, shchitasa would be psula according to me. This is talking about a case of an oaf, and again, we do half, shchitasa is kshera. Because if you hold like me, once you did half, you're done. Because again, trachea by itself is fine, going back to what we started with today. And if you don't hold like me, then it would still going to say shchita sok shera, because what? Shchita sok shera, because mamanoshach, if you say that a half is not totally done, then shechita is shera, because then you don't have any shehiyah here, you haven't done anything in the first place. So he says this price can be learned like me as well, and therefore you have no kashas on me. So we're still in the middle of this opinion, which again, we don't seem to hold like, but we're still in the middle of the opinion that seems to not be rejected yet, that 50% is actually considered to be a rov.